But I think there are universal things like health, like food, like shelter, like basic education. Every human should have. The equality, in my mind, is something that societies should provide, especially societies that are wealthy and have the resources to provide it.
The Rational View is a weekly series hosted by me, Dr. Alan Scott, providing a rational, evidence-based perspective on important societal issues.
Produced by Soapbox Media.
The world needs evidence-based public policy now more than ever. Making the right decisions should not be partisan politics. Please help spread The Rational View by going to patron.podbean.com/The Rational View. Together, we can make a better future.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of The Rational View. I'm your host, Dr. Al Scott. In this episode, I'm continuing to cast a lens into the presence of inequity and inequality in society. I know there's some pushback in general Western society against diversity, equity, and inclusion, but I don't think the values behind it are something we should ignore. I think the way that it's been done has not followed scientific principles in all cases, and has been a lot of hand-waving and posing. But I still think there are definite barriers that need to be addressed. The Rational View is about using evidence-based practices to promote justice for all. Over the years, we as a society have made great progress in addressing inequality, but unscientific biases still impact people's lives. Many folks would say that we've already equalized opportunities, and many would say great gulfs remain yet to be bridged. What does the data say? This is a job for The Rational View. If you enjoy what you're hearing, I urge you to press like on your podcast app. Love to have you listening to me. Thanks for being here. Please support the podcast if you're able. Nilanjana Dasgupta is Provost Professor of Psychology and founding director of the Institute of Diversity Sciences at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. She received her bachelor's degree in psychology and neuroscience from Smith College and a master's degree and PhD in social psychology from Yale University. She is a leader in research on implicit bias and diversity science, applying it to complex social problems. Her award-winning research has been featured widely in print and broadcast media. She's the author of the new book, Change the Wallpaper, Transforming Cultural Patterns to Build More Just Communities. Dr. Dasgupta, welcome to The Rational View.
Thank you, Al. It's great to be here. I'm looking forward to our conversation.
I appreciate you taking the time to chat with us. So your book claims to offer a science-driven approach to achieving social change, arguing that small changes to the quote-unquote wallpaper or the local culture around us are far more effective in producing structural change than seeking change through bias awareness training, symbolic acts, or relying solely on good intentions. So I really like the focus on science-driven, because I think that's often missing in much of the response to these problems. How do you see science influencing your work?
Yeah, so I think, my goal in writing this book and also in my career has been to use social and behavioral science to ask the question, how can we use data and then test out strategies that produce behavioral change in the real world, testing what seems intuitively that should work, testing whether it does work, and sometimes it does, but then weeding out the stuff that doesn't work, and then testing out what we think shouldn't work, but actually does. And what we see from the research, not just in social psychology, but in this book, I synthesize research from sociology, from economics, from neuroscience, from even architecture and geography and economics, and bring it all together to show that it is often the environment, the power of the situation that is around us that nudges our thinking and our beliefs, that then affects our actions. And those actions in relation to that of other people around us, that then ends up changing some things that involve social reality. Sometimes that happens even when we may not personally believe something. Sometimes our beliefs and attitudes come along for the ride, but we don't necessarily have to start with our attitudes and beliefs. The beliefs and attitudes might happen later on.
Interesting. Now, just to set the stage, to kind of paint the large picture of what we're addressing here, what you're trying to address with your book. Many folks I talk to would say that we've already done everything that's reasonable to equalize opportunities. We're very just as a society now, and the remaining gaps are mainly due to differences in preference amongst people. Other people, and many others, would say that there's great gulfs that remain to be bridged for equity and for social equity. What does the data say? What do we know? Set the stage for us.
I think it depends. I think it depends on what we are talking about. So on many dimensions, whether we are talking about education or health or life expectancy or wealth, there are large gaps between groups, between people. We know that worldwide there are large gaps in wealth that have become larger and larger across countries, within countries and across the world. There are large gaps in health and life expectancy. There are large gaps in education. And those gaps have been increasing. So I think that certainly there are preferences, and preferences should be left alone. But I think there are universal things like health, like food, like shelter, like basic education, that every human should have. And that's where I think the equality in my mind is something that societies should provide, especially societies that are wealthy and have the resources to provide it.
Now, you use the metaphor throughout your book, changing the wallpaper. Could you expand a bit on this metaphor by maybe providing an example of how wallpaper is what's the problem?
Yes. So there are 4 kinds of wallpaper that I talk about. So wallpaper is the metaphor for situational forces that are around us that influence our thoughts and behavior in small ways that compound over time and slowly increase the distance between us, or that can decrease the distance between us. It can make us more unfamiliar and make us distrust each other and increase polarization, or it can push us together and increase trust and increase inclusion. So the 4 kinds of wallpaper I talk about, one is material wallpaper. So it might be the physical design of places, whether a neighborhood is the kind where you see which mixes people, where you have affordable housing, plus people who have homeowners, plus people who are retired, and people in apartments and renters, or whether it's people in gated communities and you never see anybody else who are in affordable housing. So in a mixed housing situation, you would see people across social class, and you would see them on a daily basis. You would run into them in casual highs and hellos, and over time you would become acquaintances and get to know them, and get to know their circumstances and get some familiarity, so that when the need came up, you might find out something about their circumstances that might arise some empathy, or make you realize that they're experiencing something that you don't think is fair or right. That creates some space for solidarity or understanding. But in another circumstance, you might not even know that person. So that's a physical or a material wallpaper. A different kind of example might be social media, also a material wallpaper, but not a physical one, but a social media one where the algorithms can divide us. Or you can think of a different kind of algorithm that truly brings us together, that truly makes us friends. So that's material wallpaper. The second kind of wallpaper is symbolic. So think of it as stories that provide explanations for social reality, explanations for why things are, whether something is fair or unfair, whether a difference between you and me is deserved or undeserved, whether it is because of hard work or a talent difference or a difference in luck, or something in the system, right?
Yeah, I really enjoyed that discussion actually in your book, about the stories that affect us and how we view our situation compared to others. You talk about symbolic culture and shared narratives. I had a previous guest on the podcast who actually was casting the Big Bang Theory as a shared origin story for the rational world, and contrasting that with origin stories from religions, and how they glue the people together in a kind of shared narrative. The Christians share the creation story in Genesis and use it to interpret the world around them.
Yeah.
It was interesting how these stories lead to bias, from reading your book.
Yeah, exactly. I think stories are really explanations, right? Stories. A scientist like you and I would call stories a form of theory. In science, we test those stories and we test their veracity in some way against data. But in outside of science, we don't necessarily test our stories, but they are frames in our mind that provide explanations that we take for granted as the truth. And that's why they provide legitimacy to why things are the way they are. So that's a second kind of wallpaper. They're in the background, in the mind. We're not always fully aware of them, but they legitimize inequality, or they can make us question inequality. So that's the second wallpaper. The third one is representation, what I often think of as people in high places. Or another way of saying it is the people we see as portraits on the wall when you walk into a room. And those portraits on the wall tell you who are the people who are valued and respected. And if the people who are valued and respected are all within a narrow band, they all look similar and they occupy similar roles, then we automatically understand that in this organization or in this profession, to be respected and valued, you must occupy this role, or you must look or be in this way. And anybody, also the understanding is, if you don't look that way, or if you don't occupy that role, then you won't be quite so valued or respected. So the portraits on the wall signal to us who is valued more and who is not. That's a third kind of wallpaper, the people in high places. And the final kind of wallpaper are the unspoken norms and rules of the game that some people know, and which allows them to navigate the maze and climb up the professional or social ladder, that other people may not know. And typically the people who don't know those rules of the game are typically people who are working class, who may enter a social institution and just don't know what is accepted, what the etiquette is. And whereas their counterparts who are more affluent just know how to play the game. So I think of that as the maze. Some people have the roadmap when they walk into the maze, and others just don't. So those are the four kinds of wallpaper: material culture, symbolic culture, the representation or people in high places, and the unspoken rules of the game.
the people in high places one is interesting. That's basically like the dress for success kind of thing that people are taught. If you want to move up in the chain, you have to dress like the people that are at the top of the chain. And this is unlinking status to performance. Basically, it's taking on the appearance, fake it until you make it kind of thing.
Yes, I think that works to a certain extent. That you can take on the role as like an actor of the faking it till you make it you can step into that role.
Mm-hmm.
But there are some characteristics you can't take on that are identity based, and then there are other characteristics you can't take on that are role based. So somebody may not let you into a role of a manager or the lab head if you're a scientist, because you don't fit the prototype of the person who fits that role, right? So there has to be a gatekeeper who allows you in to a certain way in order for you to be allowed to step into that role.
Mm-hmm. I think many people are aware of inequality. I know, in the corporate world, many companies have implemented policies and committees to address bias in hiring practices. But you highlight the role of these invisible wallpapers, quote unquote, invisible. Obviously visible once you notice them. What isn't working in the current system? Can you maybe give an example or two of some wallpapers that people just aren't aware of, or
that people aren't aware of, or that are working?
Well, maybe give some examples of things that people aren't aware of that are hindering or causing bias.
Yeah, so I think there are, for each of these four kinds, I can give you an example of one of each that prevent or that increase inequality. So on the material side, in the book, I talk about an example of a magazine, a food magazine you might know of, called Bon Appetit, mm-hmm. where the executives who lead the magazine and who make decisions about what gets into the magazine, the C-suite people, are all in offices on the top floor. And the people who are running the show, who are testing the recipes, all of that, are in the bottom floor. It's your prototypical upstairs, downstairs situation. Mm. And the executives never get to see the people on the lower floors. So they're totally segregated. That's a classic example where the people in high places have no relationships with the rank and file employees. Mm. And that absence of mixing, the absence of normal, everyday human relationships that are not transactional, that are not about, can you do this for me? Can you give me this? Prevents people from forming relationships that allow them to get to know, oh, here's somebody who has a good idea, or who I got to know, and maybe I can give them a chance. So the physical segregation right. is one characteristic that increases bias. The flip side, on the positive side, is a startup example I talk about in the book, a tech startup, where the boss, it's the name of the company is Drift. It's I think an HR startup company where the boss has an open floor plan, and David Cancel, who was the boss at the time, I don't think he is the CEO anymore, sat with his employees in an open floor plan. So he would talk to the other people on the floor about the projects they were doing, and his employees, when they wrote anonymous reviews about employee satisfaction, talked about how much they really liked interacting with him. So they felt he knew them, they felt he knew their projects, they felt he was just genuinely curious about what they were doing. And that he would change course based on their ideas. So these are two examples of how the physical setup of the workplace design had really different effects on human relationships within the organization.
Just as an aside, these open floor plan concepts and changing your workstation daily kind of things where you're meant to mingle also is a type of wallpaper. It seems to favor extroverted people who enjoy interacting with other people, but not so much introverts who find that overwhelming. I think in that situation, you can really see a difference between how people would respond to such a situation based on their personality type.
That is true. That is a very good point. And I think there may be a middle ground where people have a combination of sometimes. So here are two types of middle grounds. One type of middle ground might be where people have some days that are remote days, where they can work from home, and some days that are office days where the social glue, where they're interacting with their colleagues in person. The other type of middle ground might be where they have some private cubicles or rooms where they can work alone, or where they're not getting distracted. Even introversion, extroversion aside, sometimes you just need to focus and you want to be alone to focus on your thoughts. I know when I'm writing, I like to work from home. When I'm doing data analysis or other meetings, I go to the university. So I do different kinds of work from my home office and my campus office. So there could be different kinds of spaces. And I know different, both corporate and university offices and nonprofit offices that have spaces that allow for both kinds of work.
Now, in the area of narratives, you highlight, some of the damaging myths that contribute to inequality from neoliberalism. Can you maybe just talk to that? Because that I found, to be telling and something I hadn't thought about before. It's like, oh yeah, that does make sense.
Yeah, the neoliberalism ideology is so pervasive. It's so pervasive that I think we don't even know it's there. That wallpaper is profoundly thick, I think. It's the idea that success really is all about being driven and individual freedom and agency and looking for opportunities. And that if you only let people be free, the cream will rise to the top, and basically the dregs will go to the bottom. And that pure freedom is the only thing we need to do to separate the best from the worst. We know it's not true, because when you do that and you take away regulations, what we found all across the world since the 70s, since neoliberal policies started spreading across the world in uneven ways, is that's correlated tremendously with greater wealth inequality, and both at the country level and also at the individual level. So countries that have adopted neoliberal policies, about 4 years after that, at the individual level, you see individual adoption of those ideologies, and then you see greater sort of individual inequality. So I think that neoliberal ideologies also assumes that the people who are successful deserve what they get, and the undeserving also deserve what they get. Yeah.
So the poor are lazy, and it's not due to any bad luck. It's just you aren't working hard enough if you aren't doing well in this society, because everyone has the same opportunity.
Yeah, the barriers, the potholes in the road are just invisible, And personal responsibility is the attribution that is typically made for struggle or for failure. And I think what is often missed is that human beings, by our nature, we are fallible. We make mistakes, but some people's mistakes are protected. Some people essentially can have the wealth and means to hire the right lawyers, and their mistakes are protected. Other people's mistakes are not. So the initial mistakes are, some people get the opportunity to get course correction, and other people don't. So I think there are several kinds of things that are missed. One is that the potholes in the road are just not seen. That's one. Two is that when we as humans make genuine mistakes, and we do, that based on wealth, some people are saved and other people are not, and that then creates initial differences that over time compound. And those compounding advantages become interest. You can think of it as a bank account, compounding interest in one side and compounding bank fees that then become more and more put you in a negative balance.
You discuss in your book something that I've always been interested in, is the trope of male genius as a type of wallpaper surrounding STEM fields. Many engineers and physicists will tell you that the most outstanding geniuses of history have been men. Is innate genius a sex-linked trait, or is this a misconception?
So I don't know if you read my favorite story in the book that I start with, which is Einstein's story.
Yes, I enjoyed that.
With the prototypical, first scientist that we think of when we think of geniuses is Albert Einstein. But when you actually read his biography and some of the letters a collection of letters that have been published, which I did in the course of writing this book, what I discovered, and which I write about in the book, is that he actually had quite a lot of failures and struggles, and through elementary and school, he struggled a lot, and early in life was considered quite average, and didn't get into the Polytechnic Institute in the first round, and was asked to take some extra classes and try again. Got it in the second time he tried. Was considered sort of mediocre. And then when he graduated, he couldn't get a permanent job. He temped. He taught high school students. And then with the help of his classmate's father, got a job at the patent office. His wife, who was also a physics student at the Polytechnic, who got pregnant before they were married, which was obviously at the time
big no-no.
Not a total no-no. Then didn't pursue her career in physics. Was his informal collaborator, but her name never appears on any of his publications. There's been this big debate about whether she should have been a co-author. In any event, that aside, all along his life, there's been many struggles and many failures, but the way we tell his story is one of linear brilliance. But that's not his story. In fact, his story, I think, is far more interesting. His story is circuitous, like any human story. It's filled with struggle, failure, people who helped, parents who supported them, collaborators who may or may not have been acknowledged. And so I think that we just tell stories that are inaccurate reflections of human potential. And if we could tell real stories, back to the story example, that talent is a mixture of struggle, failure, success, much like science is. A lot of our experiments don't work. Sometimes they work partially. sometimes, I tell all my graduate students, 50% of my experiments don't work. And through those failures, you find out, then you ask yourself, okay, why did it not work?
That's a very good ratio, by the way.
Right? Is it that the hypothesis was wrong? Is it that the method didn't work? Those are the questions we should ask.
Mm-hmm.
So, but back to your point, that the myth of brilliance is a myth. I think the idea of brilliance, whether it's for men or women, is a myth. And I think it doesn't serve anyone. It doesn't serve any of our students.
Mm.
I think it demoralizes them because it makes success seem unattainable.
Mm-hmm. I think that the story of Einstein is one of hope for people who are struggling and that just, you stick to it, you work, and you can have great impacts on your field. So I think that's very, inspiring to read rather than disincentivizing, like the myth of genius. The myth of genius really, I think, impacts women's education and career choices, really.
Right. So
we have this group of men in engineering and the physical sciences that, see themselves as geniuses, and women see themselves as not able to be geniuses due to this wallpaper.
Right. I want to add to this point you're making. In one of my earlier papers, I found with my at the time my postdoc, that when we presented women students with stories, biographies, short biographies of successful women, this was not in science, but in successful women in all kinds of fields. Some were in science, some were in business, some were in law, various kinds of fields. Women who were either portrayed as superstars, or the same stories were portrayed as women who started off as having ordinary beginnings, and somehow through lots of trial and error, they got to that very successful end. Mm. What we found is that if we just portrayed them as superstars, our participants actually, although they admired them, they were not inspired to see themselves as achieving the same success. And in some studies, we found that it actually deflated them. It made them see themselves as more different than these successful women. It increased the sense of difference, that those women are very different from me, or I'm very different from them. Mm. But if we told the same story as, look, they actually started off like you, and then they ended up being that successful, then they felt much more inspired.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Same stories, just told in a different way.
So these myths of linear brilliance are very damaging, right? This, and once you have someone who is thought of as brilliant, in, the backstory kind of gets smudged out too, right? You don't want to think, you want to pick out, I remember him in public school and he did something brilliant. His artistry was stood out in some way.
Right. And I think that those kinds of stories about brilliance are particularly damaging to people who don't see very many people like them in that field. Is part of the finding of this research, this brilliance research. So some of this is done by Andre Simpian and his colleagues and collaborators, that there are the women scientists, early career scientists and graduate students and assistant professors who see, who are most affected by it are women of color, who are already in the field, but who feel more like imposters because they think that they can't be that brilliant. Mm-hmm. So the brilliance stereotypes affect the people who don't see very many people like themselves in the field.
It basically enhances their outsider syndrome.
Exactly. Beautifully put. Exactly.
It's a problem with confidence, effectively. Like a lot of people say, I can do this. I see other people like me doing this.
That's right. So if we change that brilliance narrative, and if we told the real Einstein story, if you will, coming back to that story that I started that chapter with in the book, if we told the real Einstein story, imagine how much more inspiring that would be. That Einstein was a guy who didn't graduate from high school, who didn't pass his exam to get into college the first time, and look where he ended up.
Mm-hmm.
So, imagine what is possible for me. We should tell real stories with all the warts.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So, what from your research, what would you say are the most effective changes that we could make that would support and promote equality?
I think it depends on, there are some things that all of us can do, and there are some things that are probably more in the realm of what people in leadership roles can do, whether they are informal or formal leaders. So I'm wondering which one you want me to start with.
How about we start with leaders?
Okay. All right. So I think that for your listeners who are leaders, I would say the first thing. Given that we are in the world of this sort of, at least here in the United States, a backlash against various kinds of diversity related programs. I would say the first thing would be to ask to sort of question what are the criteria that the leader is using to define what talent is. And I think that the best way to think about talent, or the way to hire, whether it's admission or hiring, is to use a combination of achievement and barriers overcome. So we usually think of in hiring, we think of what are the experiences and skills this applicant has.
Mm-hmm.
We should also, I think, ask ourselves, and what has this person overcome? That combination tells you how much can this person really push and drive despite and achieve despite everything, all of the struggles. So I would say it's a both and kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
What have they achieved, and what barriers have they overcome? So that's one thing to ask. The second thing on the issue of ask hard questions about what criteria matter is, in terms of skills and experiences, leaders should ask themselves, are those skills and experiences some things that are free of affluence? Meaning, can people acquire those experiences and skills without having to have money? So, for example, internships. Can the applicant get those internships are those internships unpaid internships? Only people who come from wealthy backgrounds can get internships and not have to worry about not being paid, because their family can support them. But anybody who's working class cannot afford to do that. Or SAT scores or standardized test scores that are strongly correlated with social class. Why? Because a student can take those test prep courses that can teach them how to take the test and do really well. Others who can't pay for those tests can't take those tests, and they can only take the test once. So use skills that are not so dependent on affluence.
Okay.
So that's the second thing. The third thing I would say is be careful about judging a book by its cover. By that, I mean, oftentimes we use confidence, accent, and pedigree, things that are visible, as indicators of real talent, but they're actually not. The way I speak, I may sound to you as British or to some of your speakers, is not an indication of my talent. It's just the way I speak, right? So talent should be measured by people's skills on something that is tangibly measured as a skill. but how confident somebody appears, the way they speak, and the pedigree of where they come from is not an indicator of talent. It's just something that is visible. It's just the bells and whistles. It's just the fancy stuff. It's not really talent. But it often really blinds us. It's like this flashy thing.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the third thing. The fourth thing I would say is I think leaders should focus on talent development rather than talent discovery. So talent development means that if you put somebody in an environment and treat them as a trainee or an employee, if the soil is fertile, they will grow and they will thrive. Research shows that fertile soil, I'm using this soil metaphorically, of course,
Mm-hmm.
fertile soil is one where the relationships among the employees has mutual support. People work together. It's more collaborative than competitive. The norms emphasize a lot of practice, a lot of honest feedback from the supervisor, a lot of rewards for improvement rather than perfection, a lot of iterative sort of practice, feedback, improvement, practice, feedback, improvement, and expectation that there will be failure and struggle. So that iterative sort of loop is something that is part of the culture. And the work is associated with something that is personally meaningful to the employees.
Okay.
Those characteristics create fertile soil.
That's important. The meaningfulness is definitely a motivator, I think. So, okay, that's your advice to leaders. Let's go to the run-of-the-mill folk, the workers, the everyday Joes that aren't in a leadership position. What can we do to make a difference?
I would start in the same place in terms of the fertile soil. I would say if the run-of-the-mill, the people who are the members of the team, the employees, the workers, if they also create a culture that is more collaborative than competitive, if they are more involved in connecting the work with whatever is meaningful to them, and if that is part of the culture of the work, that is super important. If they're aligned with what the leader is trying to do. So that's one. Two, I'm going to come back to stories. So one of the things that I've been thinking a lot about applying the research to a recommendation on the ground. Imagine if an organization had a practice where people in the company or the organization opted in to have some sort of a story corps, which is a National Public Radio program, where they could interview somebody they didn't know in their organization, but they were curious about, and with their permission, tell their story on a web platform with. And essentially it becomes a story sharing way, a story sharing, sort of a digital story sharing platform.
Mm-hmm.
That allows people in the organization to get to know each other, to humanize each other in a way that is not just transactional. It makes people more real, more human, and it makes the relationships that are not just about work. So I think that's something I would also recommend. I don't know if you want to pick up on either one of these or something else.
Yeah, I really like your discussion at the start. Actually, I just want to re-emphasize that the mixing between different classes or the hierarchical structure of both physical living conditions in gated communities versus mixing with people of different social stature, I guess. I think that's the isolation is what really allows
Yeah.
polarization to ferment and
Yeah.
drive, the othering of people that you don't talk to, both
Yes.
on social media and also physically, which, again, it's not something I had thought about that much, but is an obvious parallel to the social media isolation that we get of, left versus right or rich versus poor. Something that I've, it reiterated quite a bit is reach out, cross these boundaries. We have to talk between the people rather than in isolation. And all of the social structures that we've built are working against that to keep people isolated. So I think that one in my mind is very important.
Yeah. So to pick up on that, Al, I would say if employees or people in an organization could advocate for a communal space, to just like a lunchroom, a communal or a coffee room, to a communal space to hang out, to just have their lunch. That is not the annual holiday party. I think that is the place, that one of those places, an everyday place where you see people, where you fill your water bottle or you get your tea or coffee, that prevents the polarization. It's essentially anything that is a physical place or a storytelling place that allows social mixing. I think that's the principle. Things that allow social mixing, that is everyday, repeated, small nudges that will allow people to get to know each other, and humanize each other. And over time, we will find out things that are maybe not visible to each other, to ourselves or to one another, that will reveal some things that might allow us to see stories about you or me, that will allow us to see, oh, this is something that is going on in so and so's life. And those stories will reveal some vulnerability or some inequality that is not just one person's story, that will get stitched together into a pattern. And from those stories, we can see something more structured, more systemic. Stories are a way that allow us insight into something more systemic. Systemic stuff is very, very abstract. It's hard to see. But if we can see multiple stories and we can see a pattern, now we can see, oh, here are 10 people I know who are having similar experiences around this healthcare issue. Now I understand it. I don't have this, but here are 5 or 6 people who seem to be having this problem. There must be something going on with this healthcare thing. So that's how we see it. But we need to have conversations in order to even know that.
Indeed. So we're getting towards the end of our time slot here. It's been great to chat with you. Is there anything else you'd like to highlight from your book that we haven't covered yet?
Yes, I think the one thing I would say that maybe we've sort of talked around it, but I think it's worth mentioning it explicitly, that one of the messages in the book is that the action that works best to change the wallpaper is not individual, it's collective. That once we see how the power of situations nudge our thoughts and behavior, and once we understand how that works, in order for us to change it, we have to find other people who share our concerns, and then act together and coordinate our actions, and then act repeatedly. It's a marathon, not a sprint. Act repeatedly to change something. So I would say acting collectively is one thing I would say, because these situations are powerful enough that individuals get swamped out by the power of the situation. That's one. Two, I would say collective action that targets material conditions rather than symbolic actions that hold up a banner or that have a lawn sign.
Mhm.
So actions that change material things are more powerful than symbolic ones. I don't mean that symbolic ones mean nothing, but I think if I had to make a choice, I would say material conditions matter more. And three, I would say that acting together locally is more sticky. It gets more traction,
Mhm.
because acting in a larger way at the state level, at the national level, often gets diluted by other forces.
Mhm.
But local action tends to get more traction. So those are the three things I'll leave you with.
Local action gets more traction. That's a slogan.
Yes, local action gets more traction. That's true. That's a good one. I should remember that.
Yeah, we'll footnote that. Thank you so much for joining us on The Rational View, Dr. Dasgupta. I appreciate talking to you.
Thank you, Dr. Scott. Thank you for having me.
Okay, bye-bye.
If you'd like to follow up with more in-depth discussions, please come find us on Facebook at The Rational View and join our discussion group. If you like what you're hearing, please consider visiting my Patreon page at patron.podbean.com/therationalview. Thanks for listening.